Turn around, hands behind your back, now.
Officer, I'm a 62-year-old disabled veteran. My hands are empty.
You're refusing my order, that's
This
resisting.
camera is recording you escalating a non-existent threat.
Last warning.
Force me down, and you cause permanent damage. You'll answer for this.
Officer, I am a 62-year-old man recovering from shrapnel surgery in my left hip. If you force me to the concrete, you will be causing permanent damage to a disabled veteran. My hands are empty. I am compliant. But your body camera is recording the fact that you are escalating a non-existent threat. It was 10:45 on a Tuesday morning in a quiet, manicured cul-de-sac in Charlotte, North Carolina. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Officer Kyle Miller, 26 years old and full of adrenaline that had no business being, there was currently twisting the arm of a man who had cleared rooms in Fallujah and led convoys through the Arghandab River Valley. The man being pressed against the warm aluminum siding of his own garage door was Marcus "Gunny" Thorne. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't begging, he was calculating. Officer Miller had absolutely no idea who he was holding. He didn't know that the suspect had retired as a gunnery sergeant after 24 years in the Marine Corps. He didn't know that Thorne held a Silver Star for valor. All Miller saw was a large black man in a grease-stained t-shirt holding a wrench in the driveway of a $500,000 home, and his bias had filled in the rest of the narrative. "I told you to spread your legs," Miller shouted, kicking Thorne's ankles apart. Thorne winced as his bad hip flared with sharp electric pain, but he didn't break his posture. He had endured worse handling from enemy combatants than he was currently getting from this hyper-aggressive public servant. "Officer," Thorne said, his voice dropping to that terrifyingly calm register that every Marine knows means danger. "You are currently detaining me on my private property. You have not articulated a crime. You have not stated a reasonable suspicion. You are hurting a disabled citizen. Every second of this is actionable in federal court." "Shut up. You're under arrest for failure to obey and resisting an officer," Miller snapped, reaching for his handcuffs. "Under arrest for failing to obey an unlawful order?" Thorne asked, looking over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto the camera lens clipped to Miller's chest. "Make sure you log that statement, son. You're going to need it." Before we get into the devastating consequences of this arrest, I need you to take a second. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from city-state country. We want to know who is standing watch with us. And if you believe that a man's home is his castle and that the Constitution applies to everyone regardless of skin color, hit that subscribe button. You need to see how this ends. The handcuffs clicked. The cold steel bit into Thorne's wrists. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in a long time, not since a survival training course in the late 90s. He took a deep breath, smelling the scent of the freshly cut grass and the distinct odor of fear coming off the officer. Miller was terrified, though he hid it behind aggression. Thorne wasn't scared. He was disappointed. And he was ready to go to war, not with a rifle, but with the law. To understand how a quiet morning turned into a civil rights lawsuit, we have to go back 20 minutes. It had been a perfect morning. Marcus Thorne had spent the last 6 months restoring a 1948 Harley-Davidson Panhead. It was a labor of love, a way to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet after fully retiring from his post-military consulting gig. He was a man who respected machinery, precision, and order. He had the motorcycle on a lift in the center of his driveway. Parts were laid out on a surgical blue cloth, carburetors, gaskets, chrome housing. Thorne was wearing his working clothes, a faded green t-shirt that said USMC in cracked yellow lettering and a pair of oil-stained cargo pants. He was wiping down a piston head when he heard the tires crunch on the asphalt. He didn't look up immediately. It was a public street. Cars passed by. But then the sound of the engine stopped. The idle purr of a Ford Explorer police interceptor lingered at the end of his driveway. Thorne sighed, placed the piston gently on the cloth, and wiped his hands on a rag. He knew this routine. He had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and while his direct neighbors were wonderful, the roving patrols were a different story. He turned to face the street. The cruiser was stopped. Officer Kyle Miller was behind the wheel staring. He was scanning the scene, the dismantled bike, the black man with tools, the open garage, revealing a pristine workshop. In Miller's mind, the equation didn't balance. He saw chop shop where he should have seen restoration. Miller put the car in park and stepped out. He didn't adjust his hat or wave. He rested his hand on his duty belt right near the holstered Glock and walked up the driveway with a strut that projected authority he hadn't earned. "Morning," Thorne said, keeping his voice neutral. He didn't move toward the officer. He stayed by his bike. "Whose bike is this?" Miller asked. No greeting, no introduction, just an interrogation. Thorne paused. "It's mine. Can I help you with something, officer?" "You got a title for it." Miller walked closer, stepping onto the private property of the driveway, his eyes darting around the garage looking for something. Stolen parts. Drugs. Who knew? "I do," Thorne said. "It's in the safe inside my house, along with the title for the house and the truck. Is there a report of a stolen 1948 panhead in the area?" Miller didn't like the tone. He stopped 5 feet from Thorne. "We've had a lot of thefts in this area recently. Catalytic converters, high-end bikes. Just checking to make sure everything is on the up and up. You live here?" "I do." "You got ID?" Thorne took a slow breath. He knew the Fourth Amendment better than most lawyers. He had taught rules of engagement and constitutional law as part of a DOD contracting course. He knew exactly where the line was. "Officer," Thorne said, leaning back against his workbench. "I am on my private property. I am not operating a motor vehicle on a public roadway. Unless you have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that's RAS, that I have committed a crime, are committing a crime, or are about to commit a crime, I am not required to identify myself to you. This is a consensual encounter, and I am choosing not to consent to an interrogation." Miller's face flushed a deep red. He was used to compliance. He was used to people being afraid of the badge. He wasn't used to a man in grease-stained pants quoting case law at him. "I'm investigating a disturbance," Miller lied. It was a clumsy, desperate lie. The street was dead silent. "And now you're being uncooperative. That gives me suspicion. Let me see your ID or we're going to have a problem." "A disturbance," Thorne repeated, his voice dropping an octave heavy with skepticism. He gestured to the empty, silent cul-de-sac. "The only disturbance on this block, officer, is you trespassing on my driveway. You are now attempting to manufacture reasonable suspicion based on my refusal to waive my rights. That is a violation of Terry v. Ohio and Brown v. Texas." Officer Miller stepped closer, invading Thorne's personal space. The young officer was posturing, trying to use physical proximity to intimidate a man who had stared down warlords. "I don't need a law lesson from a grease monkey," Miller spat. "I need to know who you are and why you're stripping a $20,000 bike in a driveway that clearly doesn't belong to you." "Doesn't belong to me." Thorne's eyes narrowed. There it was. The implicit bias laid bare. "And why would you assume this home doesn't belong to me?" "Look at you," Miller scoffed, gesturing vaguely at Thorne's dirty clothes and skin color. "And look at this place. I'm not stupid. Now, for the last time, give me your ID." "No," Thorne said firmly. "I am not compelled to assist you in your fishing expedition. If you have evidence of a crime, arrest me. If you don't, get off my property." "You're detaining me from doing my job." Miller argued, his logic twisting into knots. "I am not detaining you. You are free to leave. In fact, I am asking you to leave. I am trespassing you from this property. Any further presence here without a warrant is a violation of my rights." It was at this moment that the front door of the house next door opened. Mrs. Gable, a 68-year-old retired school principal with a sharp wit and zero tolerance for foolishness, stepped out onto her porch. She held her smartphone up the camera lens, pointed directly at the driveway. "I'm recording Marcus," she shouted clearly. "I see everything, officer. Why are you harassing Mr. Thorne?" Miller whipped his head around. Witnesses. He hated witnesses. "Ma'am, go back inside. This is police business. You are interfering." "I am standing on my own porch, young man," Mrs. Gable yelled back. "And I am filming a public servant in the performance of his duties. That is my First Amendment right. I suggest you lower your voice." Miller turned back to Thorne, his anger boiling over. He felt cornered. He had lost control of the situation, and in his mind, the only way to regain control was to escalate force. He couldn't walk away now. He would look weak. He had to win. "That's it," Miller said, reaching for his radio. "I'm done asking. You're failing to obey a lawful order to identify." "It's not a lawful order if there is no underlying crime," Thorne stated calmly. "Turn around." Miller commanded, his hand going to his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are under arrest." Thorne looked at the officer. He looked at the gun on Miller's hip. He calculated the odds. He could physically overpower this boy in 3 seconds. He knew the leverage points. He knew the takedowns. But he also knew that if he raised a hand, he would be shot, and the narrative would be, "Violent suspect attacks officer." He would be just another statistic. The only way to win this war was to lose this battle. "I am complying under duress," Thorne said loud enough for Mrs. Gable's phone to pick up. He slowly turned his back, dropping the wrench onto the rag. "I am placing my hands behind my back. I am not resisting. Mrs. Gable, please call my attorney. The number is on my fridge. You have the spare key." "I'm calling him right now, Marcus," she replied, her voice trembling with rage. Miller grabbed Thorne's wrists, roughly yanking them upward. That was when the physical altercation from the beginning of our story occurred. The shoving, the yelling about resistance that wasn't happening. Miller was performing for the camera now, trying to sell a struggle that didn't exist. "You're making a mistake that is going to cost you your badge," Thorne whispered as the cuffs clicked shut. "Tell it to the judge." Miller sneered, spinning Thorne around and marching him toward the patrol car. The back of the Ford Explorer was cramped, smelling of stale sweat and industrial disinfectant. Thorne sat sideways to accommodate his stiff hip, his hands numb from the over-tightened cuffs. He closed his eyes and began his breathing exercises. In for 4 hold, for 4 out, for 4. He needed his heart rate low. He needed his mind sharp. Officer Miller sat in the front seat for a long moment before starting the engine. He was typing something into his computer, likely trying to figure out what charge code to input. He was already second-guessing himself, looking in the rearview mirror at the silent man in the back. "You know," Miller said as he pulled out of the cul-de-sac, his voice trying to sound casual, "if you had just shown me your ID, none of this would have happened. You did this to yourself." Thorne said nothing. He stared out the window at the passing suburban lawns. "You think you're some kind of lawyer?" Miller continued, glancing back. "Talking about case law. You guys always have an excuse. Just comply and complain later, that's how it works." Thorne remained silent. Tactical silence. Anything he said now would be twisted. He would save his words for the deposition. "Fine, be quiet," Miller muttered, turning up the radio. "We'll see how quiet you are when you're in a holding cell." The drive to the precinct took 15 minutes. When they arrived, Miller pulled into the Sallyport. He hauled Thorne out of the car, gripping his arm tightly, parading him into the intake area. The precinct was busy. Phones were ringing. Officers were walking back and forth with paperwork. At the booking desk sat Sergeant Thomas Mac McAllister. Mac was 55, with a gray buzz cut and eyes that had seen too much. He had been on the force for 30 years. He was tired. He was cynical, but he was fair. Miller walked Thorne up to the desk. "Booking one for failure to obey resisting and suspicious conduct." Mac looked up from his computer. He looked at Miller, then he looked at the man in handcuffs. Mac's eyes widened slightly. He squinted. He leaned forward. "Take those cuffs off," Mac said quietly. Miller blinked. What Sarge he was resisting. He refused to ID. "I said," Mac's voice was like gravel grinding on steel, "take the damn cuffs off him, now." "Sarge, I don't think that's safety protocol." "Boy." Mac stood up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. The room went quiet. "Do you know who you just brought into my house?" Miller looked confused. "Some guy, refused to ID, was stripping a bike." Mac shook his head slowly, a look of pure disgust on his face. "Process his wallet. Give me his wallet." Miller reached into Thorne's back pocket. Thorne had allowed this search as part of the booking procedure and slapped the leather wallet on the counter. Mac opened it. He flipped past the credit cards. He flipped past the driver's license. He stopped at the laminated card in the clear window. It wasn't just a military ID. It was a retired status card coupled with a current Department of Defense contractor clearance badge, level top secret. And tucked behind it was a small gold-embossed card that members of the Silver Star Association carried. Mac looked at the name on the ID Marcus L. Thorne. Gunnery Sergeant U.S.M.C. retired. Mac looked up at Thorne. "Gunny." He nodded respectfully. "I saw you speak at the VFW last month about police ethics and community engagement." "Sergeant," Thorne replied calmly. "I'd shake your hand, but—" He gestured with his head to his bound wrists. Mac glared at Miller. "Unlock him, and then go sit in the captain's office. Don't speak to anyone, don't touch a radio, just sit." Miller's face went pale. "Sarge, he wouldn't show ID." "Did he commit a crime, Miller?" Mac asked, his voice rising. He was suspicious." "Unlock him," Mac roared. Miller fumbled with the key. His hands were shaking. He unlocked the cuffs and Thorne rubbed his wrists, grimacing as the blood flow returned. "Thank you, Sergeant," Thorne said, massaging the red indentations on his skin. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Thorne," Mac said, coming around the desk. "I need to get the watch commander down here. This is a mess." "It is," Thorne agreed. "But before you call him, I need you to preserve evidence. I want the body cam footage from Officer Miller locked immediately so it cannot be deleted or edited. I want the GPS logs from his cruiser, and I want a copy of the dispatch call log to prove that no one called in a theft." "You'll have it," Mac promised. "Miller, get out of my sight." Miller walked away. His shoulders slumped, looking like a dead man walking. He knew deep down that he had just stepped on a landmine. 10 minutes later, Lieutenant O'Malley stormed into the booking area. O'Malley was a career politician in uniform, always worried about PR and budgets. When he saw Marcus Thorne standing by the coffee machine, chatting calmly with Sergeant Mac, he looked like he might have a stroke. "Mr. Thorne," O'Malley said, extending a hand, sweating profusely. "I'm Lieutenant O'Malley. I just heard from Mac. There seems to be a terrible misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding, Lieutenant," Thorne said, not taking the hand. "Your officer arrested me on my own property for exercising my Fourth Amendment rights. He used excessive force on a disabled veteran. He manufactured a charge of resisting arrest to cover up an unlawful detention. That's not a misunderstanding. That is a deprivation of rights under color of law." Title 18, U.S. Code Section 242. O'Malley swallowed hard. Thorne spoke the language of the law better than the department's legal team. "We can drop all charges immediately," O'Malley said quickly. "We'll expunge the arrest record. You can walk out of here right now. We'll handle Miller internally. Just let's put this behind us." Thorne laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. Lieutenant, I'm going to walk out of here, but I'm not putting this behind me. You have an officer who thinks he can bully citizens because of how they look. If he did this to me, he's done it to kids who don't know the law. He's done it to single mothers who can't afford a lawyer. I'm not fighting this for me. I'm fighting it for them. Please, O'Malley pleaded. Let's discuss this in my office. The only discussion I will have is through my attorney, Thorne said. I am leaving now. I expect the digital copies of the arrest report and the footage sent to my counsel by close of business today. Do not test me on this. Thorne turned and walked out of the precinct. He walked with a limp. His hip was throbbing, but he held his head high. He called an Uber from the sidewalk. As he waited, he saw Mrs. Gable's text message video posted. 10,000 views in 20 minutes. Lawyers are calling. Thorne smiled for the first time that day. The war had begun. By Wednesday morning, the video titled "Combat Vet Handcuffed in Driveway for Fixing Bike" was the #1 trending topic on social media. Mrs. Gable had a steady hand and the audio was crystal clear. The world watched Officer Miller sneer, "I don't need a law lesson from a grease monkey." They watched Thorne calmly cite the law. They watched the unlawful arrest. The public outrage was nuclear. Conservative veterans groups and liberal civil rights organizations groups that usually agreed on nothing were united in their fury. Here was a man who had served his country being treated like a criminal in his own home. On Thursday, Thorne's attorney, a shark named David Ross, who specialized in police misconduct, filed a federal lawsuit. It was a masterpiece of legal writing. It didn't just sue the city. It sued Officer Kyle Miller in his individual capacity, stripping away the shield of the department. The lawsuit alleged unlawful seizure, false arrest, excessive force, and First Amendment retaliation. But the killer blow was the Monell claim, alleging that the city had failed to train its officers properly, creating a culture where constitutional violations were routine. The internal affairs investigation was swift and brutal. Usually these things drag on for months. This one took 2 weeks. The investigators pulled Miller's history. They found the pattern. Over his 4 years on the force, Miller had a stop rate of black motorists that was 4 times the department average. He had 18 complaints for rudeness and aggression, all dismissed by previous supervisors as proactive policing. But with the world watching, those dismissals looked like complicity. They found body cam footage from 3 months prior where Miller had told a teenager, "I am the law, you little punk." They found texts on his personal phone joking about thumping thugs. Miller's defense of qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that protects officers from lawsuits unless they violate clearly established rights, evaporated. Every court in the land had established that you cannot arrest someone on their own property for refusing to ID without reasonable suspicion. It was Law Enforcement 101. Miller had no shield. 6 weeks after the incident, the city manager held a press conference. He looked tired. "Effective immediately, Officer Kyle Miller has been terminated from the Charlotte Police Department for cause," he announced. "His actions were a violation of our policy, the law, and the public trust." Miller was gone, but Thorne wasn't done. The lawsuit moved forward. The city attorneys knew they would lose in front of a jury. If a jury saw Marcus Thorne with his Silver Star lapel pin limping to the witness stand to describe how he was humiliated in front of his neighbors, they would award him millions. They settled. The check was for $850,000. Marcus Thorne didn't buy a new car. He didn't go on vacation. He took the check, endorsed it, and walked it over to the Veterans Legal Defense Fund, a non-profit that provided free legal counsel to veterans facing issues with law enforcement or the VA. "I don't want the money," Thorne told the local news in his only interview. "I want the change. I want officers to know that the badge is a symbol of service, not a crown of authority. If you can't respect the Constitution you swore to uphold, turn in your gun and go find another job." The story ends where it began, in the driveway. It was a Tuesday 4 months later. The leaves were turning orange and gold. The air was crisp. Marcus Thorne was kneeling by the 1948 panhead. The chrome was polished to a mirror shine. The engine was fully assembled. He stood up, wiping his hands on a fresh blue rag. He turned the key. He kicked the starter. Thump, thump, potato, potato. The ancient engine roared to life, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat that shook the pavement. It was the sound of freedom. The sound of something broken being made right again. Mrs. Gable waved from her porch. Thorne waved back. He sat on the bike, feeling the vibration through his bones. He was free. He was vindicated. But as he looked down the street, waiting for the oil to warm up, he felt a lingering tightness in his chest. He scanned the road, checking for cruisers. The instinct was there now. It hadn't been there before. He realized that even though he had won, he had lost something too. The innocence of believing that his service shielded him was gone. He was just a man in America, and that meant he had to be watching always. But he was ready. He had his camera installed on the bike now. He had his law. He had his voice. What would you have done if you were in Gunny Thorne's boots? Would you have handed over your ID just to keep the peace? Or would you have stood your ground for your rights? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, rights are like muscles. If you don't exercise them, you lose them. Stay safe, keep your cameras rolling, and I'll see you in the next story.